So if you spend enough time in black spaces speaking to black people about black issues, you'll meet several people who believe integration was a mistake. They'll usually say it like, like a hot take, like integration was a mistake, kind of in like barbershop settings. And it's usually one of them ones that can kind of shake the room up a little bit. They know it's going to get everybody up in arms. But yeah, they'll say integration was a mistake. We were better off before, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And look, I truly understand why people feel that way. When you see what was lost, right? Businesses, the schools that shut down, neighborhoods, you can understand the anger. But here's the thing though, if we're measuring integration by what it delivered, we're measuring something that never actually happened. I mean, think about it. Like, this isn't a hot take. Words have meanings. When we say integration failed, we're letting America off the hook for never completing integration in the first place. We're diagnosing the disease, which is segregation, as the cure for current issues because really we only took half the medicine and expected full healing, if that makes sense. We took half and wonder why we're still sick. And I feel like that matters because sometimes instead of pushing to complete what was started, we spend time romanticizing what was, while the segregation that was supposed to end has kind of just taken on new forms. I'm not gonna lie to y'all, when we look at the data, the integration was a mistake argument falls short. I think it's just an emotional response to a very incomplete process. The black community didn't fail at integration. Integration failed the black community. It started strong with these symbolic gestures and then just kind of fell short. And what we're living through now is not a result of too much integration. If anything, it's a result of not nearly enough of it. So what we're going to look at today, first, the real losses from integration, of which there were many. Two, we'll look at the data that shows that we're essentially still segregated. Third, we'll look at how the wealth gap actually narrowed during the civil rights era, the one period where we pushed the hardest for integration. And then finally, we'll talk about what actual genuine integration would or would have actually looked like. I want to be clear about something though on this first point. Real, tangible things were lost in the black community after integration. Real things were destroyed in the process. And this isn't hypothetical. When schools integrated in the South, thousands of black teachers and principals lost their jobs. Entire black business districts collapsed. That's facts. You got to think, before integration, segregation forced black dollars to circulate within black communities. If you were black, you couldn't shop at a lot of white stores. So you shop black. You couldn't go get your hair done at the white salon. So you get it. We couldn't get loans from white banks. Therein, black banks start to exist. Really wasn't by choice. It was economic survival under what were truly apartheid conditions. When integration began, black schools were often closed as opposed to being truly integrated. White schools weren't made to accept black principals or adjust the quota of their teachers to account for the influx of new black students. This is why you hear the stories of black students being bust into hostile environments. And economically, once black people could shop at white establishments, they often did, not just because they were thirsty to be like white people. I mean, these white establishments often had more resources, right? They probably had more products and a different variation of things than the black businesses were actually just able to provide. These white stores had never been starved by discriminatory funding. So off the rip, money is now flowing out of the community. I think the numbers tell the story well. In 1985, there were 60 black-owned banks serving their communities. By 2017, only 23 remained. Of the 50 black-owned insurance companies operating in the 80s, just 2 are left today. Black-owned retail establishments vanished by the tens of thousands. This is real loss, right? Like, if you live through that, if you watch that happen, on its face, I could easily see how you end up saying, yo, that decision to change that was a mistake. They say, see, we had our own institutions, our own economies, our neighborhoods were healthier. We were better off. basically. But that's just missing a crucial point. Why did integration destroy these institutions instead of enriching them? Why didn't black schools become a part of a newly integrated system with all their teachers and their principals and leadership retained? Why didn't integration mean white businesses and black businesses now being able to operate on equal footing in the market rather than one ecosystem being dismantled while the other now has an influx of customers? And I guess the argument can then be, well, those black institutions were able to thrive under segregation, so that must mean it's a good thing. But the thing is, those businesses survived despite segregation, right? It's not because of it. It's not a cause. It was actually a hindrance. They existed because they had to, but they were extremely underfunded, especially compared to white institutions. The moment black people had access to better funded alternatives, you can't really blame them for opting into that. It wasn't because they were self-hating, but segregation did that deliberately. It kept black businesses under-resourced. That's not a win for segregation. This is the evidence of how cruel the system actually is. So this is what I'm saying. Like, when people say integration failed, they're describing a world where integration actually happened, and the truth is it just didn't. The data shows that we're still segregated. Let's just look at schools. A 2024 report from the Albert Shanker Institute, the University of Miami, and Rutgers found that black students are twice as likely as white students to attend inadequately funded school districts and 3.5 times more likely to attend chronically underfunded districts. We're not talking about small gaps here, right? Predominantly white school districts receive on average $2,226 more per student than districts serving mostly students of color. 85% of majority black and Hispanic districts are both inadequately funded and score below the U.S. average on standardized tests, compared with just 6% of majority white districts. Let's talk about housing. 2021 U.S. Berkeley study found that more than 80% of large U.S. metropolitan areas were more segregated in 2019 than they were in 1990. So that essentially just shows in many areas we're moving completely backwards. Detroit is 80% black, while neighboring Grosse Pointe, correct me if I said that wrong, which literally shares a border with Detroit, is 90% white. Milwaukee, New York, Chicago, all of these cities have segregation where 3/4 of black residents would need to move to different neighborhoods to achieve actual integration. Meaning when they're looking at these maps, they're realizing that that's how many black people would have to move to consider this area not segregated. And the thing is, this isn't just about proximity, right? This is about access to resources. Research shows that black children raised in highly segregated communities make $4,000 less per year as adults than black children raised in white neighborhoods, and $1,000 less than those in what are considered integrated neighborhoods. So the point is, we can't say integration failed when we look at the numbers. Segregation is very much still a thing. And think about your town, right? Think about how your town is set up. Think about any time you've ever been to a place where there's a high concentration of money and business, et cetera, et cetera. You take 2 left turns, what will you get next to it? A hood of some kind. It might not be a black hood, but there'll be a hood nonetheless. Just a few miles off of wherever that central locale of money is. That is not a coincidence. That is the economically segregated design in America. Yeah, but my point is, we can't call the legal removal of white-only signs integration and then just go haul off and calling these things a mistake. Integration would have meant equally resourced communities. It's like we open doors, but we never actually walk through them. And when that political will faded in the 1980s and 90s, and especially the 2000s, we kind of just accepted that halfway state as the final product. Now, obviously, some might say, well, black people can live wherever they want now. And sure, but we all know that there's discrimination in housing, racism and discrimination when trying to buy homes. There's a proven fact about black homes being valued at lower rates, which affect your ability to move. If you can't sell your home at the appropriate price, all of these things are real factors. There's ongoing structural exclusion, and we've kind of decided to ignore it since it's not technically written into law anymore. The third point, though, I think is honestly very, very telling. When we look at the black-white wealth gap over the past 160 years, there's literally only one period where it closed faster than economic factors alone would have predicted. And that period is exactly where you'd expect it to be. There was a comprehensive Princeton University study that tracked the racial wealth gap from 1860 to 2020. At the eve of the Civil War in 1860, the white to black wealth ratio was 56 to 1. By 1900, after Reconstruction ended and Jim Crow took hold, it had fallen to 11 to 1. Slow progress. By 1960, on the eve of the Civil Rights Movement, it was 8 to 1. Then came the Civil Rights era, and something different happened completely. The ratio fell from 8 to 1 in 1960 to 5 to 1 by 1980. The Princeton researchers were explicit. They said, quote, "There's only one period where the gap closed more quickly than would be expected under an equal savings rate scenario. The period during and just after the Civil Rights Movement, from the 60s to the 80s. Black activism that led to civil rights legislation, a larger social safety net, and better labor standards gave an extra boost to black wealth accumulation. Then starting in the 1980s, everything stalled. By 2020, the ratio was back to 6 to 1, barely different from 1960. In the 40 years between 1980 and 1920, the wealth gap actually increased. Today, some studies say that white Americans own about 85% of wealth in America, while black people own 3 to 4%. To put it in concrete terms, the average per capita wealth for a white American 2019 was $338,000. For black Americans, is about $60,000. What does this show us? I think it shows that the period in which we were actively pushing for integration, for freedom, for equal rights was when there was tangible change, when there was political will and a push for legal enforcement. That's when black wealth grew faster. Not during segregation. It was the moment we decided to fight against segregation, and that progress stopped the moment we stopped fighting. And to be fair, like, wealth gaps take generations to close. But that's the point, though. We need a sustained effort, sustained integration. Instead, by the 1980s, courts stopped monitoring school integration. Housing discrimination became harder to prove and easier to ignore. And then that we already did civil rights mindset kind of just took over. We didn't really fail at integration. We just quit. So let's talk about what integration would have actually looked like, because I don't think a lot of people ever actually imagined it. Real integration wouldn't have meant closing black schools. It would have meant making all schools equally funded. It would have been racially mixed with black principals and teachers proportionally represented across the entire system. It wouldn't have meant black businesses disappearing. It would have meant black businesses competing on equal footing with everyone else, with access to capital and equal property value in their neighborhoods, equal customer bases with equal access to wealth and income. Real integration would have meant white families moving into black neighborhoods at the same rate as black families moving into white neighborhoods. It would have meant systemic investment to equalize property values and equalize school funding across different zones and different racial lines. It would have meant enforcement of fair housing laws, et cetera, et cetera. Instead, what we got was a weak, specific kind of symbolic integration. Black people, you allowed to enter white spaces. You allowed to eat out of the kitchen the people who don't like you. But the white spaces didn't redistribute any power or any resources. Black students, you can attend white schools, but this curriculum is going to continue to lean in our direction. And in the leadership won't reflect your presence here. People, you can move into white neighborhoods, but at your own risk. When they did so, obviously they face hostility, discrimination, and worse. I think that's the reason why the integration was a mistake argument kind of frustrates me. For one, it's weak, but it just assumes that integration actually happened. And for my old heads, like I said, that dealt with that loss in real time, I definitely understand how those things correlate. But integration never happened. Desegregation did happen, though. The dismantling of black institutions, that happened. But the building of genuinely integrated communities couldn't have failed when it never started. Every single time we've pushed for real resource redistribution and power sharing, black advancement has accelerated. And I feel like every time we declare a mission accomplished and that progress either stalled or reversed. The Civil Rights Act wasn't the end of the work. Brown versus Board of Education wasn't the end of work. Fair Housing Act. These were all just beginnings of movements that are meant to be ongoing. And I think in some ways we mistook the foundational pieces as the building itself. Basically, what I think this shows is that integration wasn't a mistake. Incomplete integration was. But it's not just about semantics, man. It's important not to say something like integration failed because it lets America off the hook for never actually implementing integration. We let America believe that it actually tried. We let policymakers off the hook. We let society think that Black inequality exists just because of Black inferiority and incapability, because somehow we can't thrive in integrated spaces when in actuality the spaces have never been truly integrated. The issue is not that Black people now entered into white institutions. The issue is that we never made white institutions share power, never made white neighborhoods share resources. We never made the economy share opportunity. We got access without equality, proximity without power, desegregation without integration. And look, here's the thing. I know you can't legislate away racism, but you absolutely can legislate equal funding for schools, equal funding for businesses. We can enforce fair housing. We can make discrimination expensive and integration incentivized. But those are the actions of a group who actually care. But look, I think we did it before. In the civil rights movement, and I think we can do it again. Data shows that it worked, not perfectly or not completely, but it moved the needle in tangible ways. And we kind of just stopped, if we're being honest, not because it wasn't working, but because it was, I guess you could just say, inconvenient. But I just think this matters, because if we accept the narrative that integration failed, we give up on the path forward to actual integration, actual freedom. We run the risk of retreating into separation that we tell ourselves is rooted in self-determination, but it's actually just us accepting the segregation that white supremacy wanted all along. And I think what we need to do instead is look at those milestone moments as starting blocks for where we're headed. Start making demands about what true integration looks like. We got to stop treating that old legislation, man, like it finished the job. We got to start demanding completed integration. When someone says integration failed, we remind them that it never happened. Look up the funding in your locale, man. See how well your schools are funded. When people are claiming color blindness, let them know the system ain't colorblind. But look, man, y'all let me know what y'all think about this. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I'll drop the sources to the studies about in this video today. But yeah, man, I think this was born from a barbershop conversation that triggered me. But peace and love, man. Let me know what y'all think. If y'all agree, if you disagree. Either way, it's much love.